Again, good morning. And once again, I'm David Lewis with Daphne Fettering. We've authored one of the 4 papers that will ground our discussion over the next 2 days. Our paper is called Towards a Framework for Identifying and Measuring the Benefits of Accessibility. Our objectives are 3. We want to explain, or try to explain, the motivation for understanding, if not being able to quantify, a very wide view of the benefits of accessibility. In that respect, we want to provide a systematic narrative basis for policy and political dialogue, and as well move towards a standardized, quantifiable, if not yet fully quantified, basis for economic evaluation, as Daniel spoke to earlier. First objective, the motivation. Most of the mandates for accessibility around the world acknowledge accessibility as a human right. The Americans with Disabilities Act, which I might say started the ball rolling, maps into the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution, which provides due process of law and equal access to public facilities. So it's very much a non-discrimination legal foundation at play here. But mandates also acknowledge costs and the need for cost-benefit balancing as legitimate considerations in the execution of these rights. And that's very unusual in the human rights domain. We don't put a price, a cost, on freedom of religion. We don't say you have the freedom to worship only if the cost of building your church or your mosque doesn't rise above a certain standard. And costs, as Mary Crass so aptly put it, tend to be viewed very broadly. They're very easy to count. But benefits are tougher. And so when we look at the various, or some of the constitutional and legislative bases at work here, when we look at the new Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities of the United Nations, there's language which says that accommodation is required as long as it does not impose a disproportionate, undue burden. Well, that's a back door, if I ever heard one. The Australian with Disabilities Discrimination Act says accommodation is required unless it would impose an unjustifiable hardship. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms also refers to undue hardship. In New Zealand, correct me if I'm wrong, Bridget and Stuart, but accommodation is required, including access to places, vehicles, and facilities, except when it would not be reasonable to require the provision of such special services or facilities. And that exception is a cost illusion. The European Accessibility Act, proposed this year, or last year, includes language that says that Article 3 shall apply to the extent that it doesn't impose a disproportionate burden on the economic operators concerned. So I don't need to labor this point. We've got a great deal of pressure to both articulate and measure the return on investment in accessibility, notwithstanding the fact that we are dealing with a human right. It couldn't have been said very much better than it was in a 2007 Canadian Supreme Court decision on the accessibility of commuter rail cars, which, as Anne Fry knows so well, were imported as second-hand equipment by Canada from the United Kingdom. And a case was brought to the Supreme Court indicating that they weren't really very accessible at all. And the court said, and I'll read this, I won't read all my slides verbatim, but the court wrote that a factor relied on to justify the continuity of a discriminatory barrier in almost every case is the cost of reducing or eliminating it to accommodate the needs of persons seeking access. But tribunals must be wary of putting too low a value on accommodating the disabled. And we're not very good at this point in helping courts, policymakers, and regulators in dealing with that value. Countering the risk is about bringing about policies, plans, and regulations that precipitate sufficient capital investment to trigger what I'll call the notion of a self-sustaining market or dynamic for accessible design and accessible facilities in societies across the planet. Each require a strong, when I say each, strong policy and regulatory action and sufficient capital formation require two things: a strong policy or political narrative and a means by which to attach quantitative significance to that narrative. And I want to stop here and just emphasize that we think these things are very much related but distinct requirements. And I hope and trust that this will form the basis of some discussion over the next little while, that we don't want to lay out the narrative framework for identifying and defining the benefits of accessibility only insofar as we can quantify. Because to do so shoots the investment in accessibility, the return, the demonstration of return in the foot. We believe that a strong evidence-based, but not necessarily immediately quantitatively, immediately expressible quantitatively is required to bring about a consciousness among policymakers, regulators, judges of the nature of the beast, and then to quantify insofar as the evidence and the data at any point in time and in any state or nation involved where data will be different from place to place enables. So let's talk a little bit about what we think might be a basis for a systematic narrative. I'll then go on, and our paper goes on to objective 3, which tries to demonstrate that virtually every aspect of this narrative can, in principle, be quantified. We're at different levels of evidentiary capability and data in so doing. But for the time being, for the next 5 or 10 minutes, and I'll try to stick to 30, unless I'm there already, in which case all bets are off. I'll keep going. Let's talk about the basis for a policy and political narrative. We see it something like this, that an accessibility improvement creates benefits for the supplying agency It provides benefits for users. It provides benefits for non-users. And it provides something called capability value. I'll stop to make the distinction between benefits and capability. Many of you may know much more about this growing field of capability theory better than I. But the idea of a benefit is something that people receive and gain utility from. A consumer uses a level change platform, a gap-reducing platform, and in so doing enjoys a more convenient or comfortable point of access to a rail car. It's a different thing to say that capability value, that society provides the freedom to exercise that choice. Benefits come from the world of utility maximization, as Daniel well knows. Capability rejects the utilitarian ideal of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill and goes to the 1980s work of the economist and philosopher Amartya Sen, who said we should also be worried about not just the benefits that people receive by voting with the prices they're willing to pay, but what society is able to supply to give them the freedoms to make the choices that they wish to make, whether or not they take advantage of those choices or not. Drilling down into the next line of the framework, user benefits accrue to both people with disabilities and people without disabilities. People with disabilities, we're talking about the whole range of functional disability, those with physical, developmental, and sensory disabilities. Is that reasonably visible up there? We're talking about people with what we used to call transportation disabled attributes. We're talking about the whole range of functional disabilities, whether they're visible or not, that create barriers. For people without disabilities, enough said. When I read Tony Duckenfield's paper, I added a distinction among people without disabilities who benefit, those who are encumbered with baby carriages, luggage, and the like, as distinct from as distinct from those who are unencumbered. The non-user benefits accrue to society at large when, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, accessibility opens up wider destination sheds, enabling more people to gain work or to enjoy a wider range of workplace destinations. That creates an employment gain and all the multiplier effects of those gains, which those who specialize in evaluation in the room will be saying, no, 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 those are just transfers. People change from one job to another. And I'm winking at Daniel when I say this. We don't know each other, but we talk the same code. Mm-hmm. So I'm picking on you. People, as I'll say in a few minutes, when someone with a disability gets a job due to accessibility, it's typically a job that would they would otherwise be unemployed or underemployed. And therefore, the shadow price of labor is less than the market rate. And in my view, speaking as an economist, most of those benefits are indeed additive. And then capability value, which I'll come back to in a few minutes. But I'm talking about capability value specifically for people with disabilities. Agency benefits are far and wide. I'm emphasizing improved worker safety, which has been documented, and efficiencies that come with many of the accessibility improvements that we see in all modes that give rise to improved operating and maintenance costs. Now, people with disabilities enjoy three categories of benefit: mobility benefits, improved quality of time spent, which are incremental to the mobility benefits, and improved safety. The improved mobility benefits include wider destinations sheds. That's a wider area for any given destination type, such as more schools, more jobs, more dialysis centers, a wider shed of destinations, as well as more destinations in general. There are out-of-pocket cost savings. There are time savings, which Tony Duckenfield's paper quantifies rather nicely. There are improved health outcomes, which I'll speak to in a few minutes, and I'll be interested in what Jenny Mindell has to say about that. And reduced stigmatic harms, and I'm going to say more about that. That's something that has been a sleeper in our field. We're not talking about something trivial when we reduce the shame, the embarrassment, the stigmatic harm that comes with trying to negotiate a curb that's just too steep to negotiate in a wheelchair. And it's a noteworthy point, I think, that in the United States, the Obama administration recently included in its guidance on cost-benefit analysis to agencies the need to deal explicitly with reduction in stigmatic harms. Improved safety goes to reduced fatalities, reduced injuries, and reduced property damage. People without disabilities enjoy many of the same categories of mobility. I'm sorry, I'm going to go back. Improved quality of time spent. Whether you're saving time or not, when you're using a more accessible facility, the quality of the time spent improves. There's a willingness to pay, demonstrably demonstrated in the literature, for improved comfort, convenience, and more independence, as well as the stigmatic harm. And improved safety I covered. People without disabilities incur many of the same benefits. It was actually a typo that we included reduced stigmatic harm under people without disabilities. But I'm not so sure. I'm really not so sure. I think it would be much harder to pin down. It's a stretch, but maybe that's something we can talk about. Non-user benefits go to cross-sector benefits, incremental resource savings to social service agencies, for example, that gain benefits when home-based services can be supplemented with more dispersed services. Option and insurance values and existence values. Option values are people's non-users' willingness to pay for the option of being able to use an accessible facility when in fact they don't intend to do so. Existence value, I would argue, is a valid benefit in a cost-benefit setting, and certainly in the narrative setting. It is society's willingness to pay to know that there is due process of law, to know that there is accessible design. We are all willing, well, some of us, Donald Trump isn't, but many of us are willing to reach into our pockets, to pay a little bit in taxes, to live in a society that preserves timberland that we'll never visit, and that is accessible to people with disabilities. Capability value could use a 2-day workshop of this kind, so I'm going to be fairly brief, just to say that we're arguing for an index, not like a human development index, the human development index of the United Nations, that speaks to greater participation in daily life of people with disabilities, improved health and wellness, and improved subjective well-being. And we can talk a bit more about that, but what I'm suggesting is that all large regions and countries, and this is, I'll admit, aspirational, create the data, something that Anne Fry talks eloquently about, the gaps in our knowledge, in our quantitative data. The tracks in the form of an index, people with disabilities' ability to participate in daily life, to gain access to improved health and wellness, and to have an improved sense of subjective well-being. There are two methodologies at play when we come into objective number 3, the actual quantification. Cost-benefit analysis, which we give a series of tables in which we talk about how to quantify the effects that we talk about in the framework in both original units and their monetary equivalent values. And for those items which defy under any data circumstance quantification, as some, and I'm not one of them, as some I'd argue applies to stigmatic harm. Qualitative specificity, which speaks only in narrative terms, but very specifically to the type of stigmatic harms that are at work. The capability approach I've already explained, and I'll invite you just to take a brief scan of those bullets, but it's basically about creating freedoms in society and measuring those freedoms as opposed to tracking benefits actually realized. If you've had a chance to dip into the paper, you've seen the setup of our tables. We give benefit type, or the class of benefit, whether it's a user or non-user benefit, the type of benefit, the beneficiary, a description of the benefit, the form of quantification, and how it might be monetized. Speaking first to mobility for people with disabilities, wider access to destinations through wider destination sheds is all about speaking to generated trips, something that the other papers speak to as well. The quantification goes to a well-developed history of demand analysis and a newly developing framework to get the effect of wider destination sheds. And the World Bank has done a lot of good work on this. Using geographic information systems, isochronic indexes, and quality-adjusted life years, which I'll come back to. The monetization, we're talking utility, so it's all about measuring willingness to pay through either revealed preference or stated preference methodologies. Oftentimes, contingent valuation or stated preference is the only game in town. For people with disabilities, time savings are measured through demand analysis and the very wide literature on the value of time. And improved health outcomes, I believe, can be looked at in terms of the value of quality-adjusted life years. What does that mean? This is a diagram that shows on a utility basis, a subjective well-being basis, health-related quality of life from 0 to 1. Death is 0, perfectly healthy, 35-year-old go-getter will score a perfect 1. As you'll see from the nature of the curve, the step function described by the blue area assumes a certain duration of life and deterioration in the quality of life on the vertical axis. With the mobility intervention, we get both improved quality and longer lives. Now, as Jenny Mindell might have experience with and might reject out of hand, I don't know, I'm having trouble reading. There are a lot of interventions where we've been successful in measuring the improvement in quality-adjusted life years. Hip replacements, knee replacements, coronary artery bypass surgeries. We can measure the effect of these interventions in terms of improved quality-adjusted life years, the size of area B. I believe that without a lot of trouble, we can treat mobility as a health intervention, gaining wider access to a wider range of services, to speak to Marcus's paper, including health tourism. And we can put a value on the quality-adjusted life years in a cost-benefit analytic framework by annuitizing the value of a statistical life year over 35 years to convert from quality-adjusted life years to the value of quality-adjusted life years. To give you a tangible sense of what that means, currently the value of a statistical life in the US Department of Transportation is about $6.5 million, used for safety analysis and so on. Assuming a discount rate of 3% and a 35-year lifespan, that suggests that one quality-adjusted life year gained by someone with a disability or multiple disabilities due to enhanced mobility, that one life year gained, quality-adjusted, would be worth fully $300,000. It adds up. Now we're getting into use value on the quality side. Increased comfort can be measured with willingness to pay premiums or premia. People are willing to pay more than the going value of time for a more comfortable ride, for increased convenience, and for traveling with where the time is spent in less stigmatic or embarrassing conditions. And speaking to Daphne's work with the US Department of Justice, has been quite successful in attaching willingness to pay premiums to comfort, convenience, and stigmatic harms. Speaking to the stigmatic harm issue or dignity, as I said earlier, in 2011, the value of stigmatic harm was included by the White House in cost-benefit guidelines. There have been 2 or 3 methods. I just want to thank you. I've used up 10 minutes, or I've got 10 minutes to go. 10 minutes. I thought so. Thank you. In the paper, we give a description, a long quote from an article in the Yale Law Review by a woman named Bayevsky. And I quote her because she's quoting us. So I didn't feel too embarrassed about a long quote from her. Daphne's methodology uses 3 mechanisms for valuing reductions in stigmatic harm. One called cost monetization, which says that if improving toilet access doesn't realize benefits that you can measure, quite enough to justify the costs? What would you have to put on the obvious but unquantified reduction in embarrassment to cause the cost-benefit calculation to break even? And in the case of one Department of Justice architectural regulation, that came out to something like 2 cents per use. And the Office of Management and Budget, the White House police that judged the merits of a regulatory proposal by the US Department of Transportation or whomever is making the regulatory proposal, found that to be quite acceptable as a means by which to justify what is otherwise a failure of the cost-benefit test. The weighted value of time, there's some work, including some work I did in my PhD dissertation, which is getting almost as long in the tooth as I am, which basically uses a logit type of framework to say, what are people willing to pay to spend more time in less embarrassing conditions by switching from paratransit, separate from the mainstream, to accessible vehicles? We've had some success with that methodology. Bayevsky says none of that is valid. I disagree with her. But I encourage you to read the article. It's cited in our paper. She says that you go to the general public with demanding narrative statements of in what way a situation which is to be made accessible would reduce embarrassment and harm. And clearly, if you are the Department of Corrections and taking steps to reduce prison rape, that's a very specific reduction in stigmatic harm, which you can speak to with qualitative specificity. You need the same degree of specificity to speak to the kind of embarrassment or isolation or shame or reduction in stigmatic harm that comes with transport improvements, and we can speak to that. This is the safety side. Enough said, reduced fatalities, injuries, and property damage. The risk analysis and willingness to pay-based approach applies equally to people with disabilities as to the rest of the general public. Here we have a table on people without disabilities and the quantification and monetization of those benefits. Right down at the bottom row there, and it's big enough. The macroeconomic benefits. In the narrative table that I showed a few minutes ago, that was shown as a benefit to people with disabilities. But in fact, the benefit accrues to society at large because it's a productivity improvement and an improvement in the productive capacity of the economy when we improve the employment levels and prospects of people with disabilities. That produces, as I show in the last column, the classic direct, indirect, and induced GDP effects, which, if we think about the shadow price of labor for people with disabilities, we realize that, in fact, more employment is not just changing jobs, but it's the engagement of what would otherwise be underutilized labor in the form of hiring people with disabilities. But there's something else as well. There's a productivity effect in the macroeconomic scene. When we have top left there, or your right, a benefits-driven regulation and enforcement of that regulation, which sets off capital investment. That capital investment in accessibility inspires research and development to produce the best design, the best ramp, those applications become part of the built environment, part of the competitive economy's attempt to win the work, to sell the product. And that improves productivity of the supplying companies and manufacturers, and also produces a more self-sustaining dynamic and market for accessibility. Non-use values, I think I've said enough already. We're talking about cross-sector benefits to society at large. It's demand and budget analysis driven, and monetization through budgetary resource savings. The insurance value, the option value that I talked about earlier, goes to demographic analysis and stated preference work, people's willingness to pay for option values, and the existence value can be measured and has been measured through stated preference and contingent valuation procedures. Capability. Capability analysis is complicated, and I will use my last 3 minutes or less just to say, as I said in summary earlier, that we need periodic randomized sample surveys in all large regions and states to track participation in daily life, health and wellness, and people with disabilities' sense of subjective well-being. The index of subjective well-being itself is not enough. Subjective well-being, people are wonderful. We adapt to our lot. Being disabled doesn't mean that we don't display a high sense of subjective well-being. We want to measure it and weight it into the calculation, but we want to track participation in daily life and health and wellness as well. I was asked by Lorenzo to think a little bit about the question, do capability indexes or indices affect policy? The Human Development Index is now an official government statistic in many countries. The annual publication has, my research indicates, been found to inspire serious political discussion and efforts nationally and regionally to improve lives. And examples include Roma in Central Europe. I'm not sure if we're allowed to say gypsies anymore. But there's been just definitive attention to that group, and based on the findings in human development indexes and certain ethnic groups in Mexico. Finally, the American Human Development Index looks at life through a number of lenses, and there is documented evidence that this American Human Development Index has indeed inspired some states in the United States to focus policy attention on particular groups. To conclude, we want to achieve an economically sustainable society, an economically accessible society. I'm sorry, I fractured that. To achieve a sustainable, accessible society, we need to trigger a virtuous circle of self-sustaining investment and design in accessible technology. To trigger that virtuous circle, we have to ensure sufficient capital investment to trigger the productivity and R&D improvements. To ensure sufficient capital investment, we need a strong narrative basis to inspire our policymakers, our regulators, and our judges, and we need to put our quantitative backbone behind that. But that can be gradual and adopted depending upon the state of evidence and the particular approach to evaluation in any particular nation state. And I thank you.
Thank you.